welcome to a beautiful Tuesday. We are on Long Island today. We are very excited. So, as everybody is starting to come in, my name is Jeremiah Best. I'm the educator for New York Agriculture in the Classroom, and we're excited to be able to partner with our friends at Sea Grant, as well as Widow's Hole Oyster Farm, which is in Greenhold, New York, which is down on Long Island.
So I'm Mike Sarmel. I'm here, Sea Grant Seafood Specialist and a program lead for our Marine District Extension Program. New York Sea Grant is a cooperative organization through Stony Brook University as well as Cornell University. Cornell runs our extension program, which is what myself and Emma Forbes, my colleague here, who's our aquaculture specialist. We do a lot of work with the industry. So we work directly with the seafood industry and the aquaculture industry, helping them to understand kind of the research that's being done in academia and make that applicable on the farm or in the seafood facilities. So really working with those industries to help them enhance their businesses using science and sound science that's taking place throughout the state at different academic institutions, as well as with some of our Sea Grant funded researchers. We also have a research program that's funded through the National Sea Grant Program, where we fund different various research across the state, all related to coastal issues, coastal practices, aquaculture, fisheries.
So I do have a question right off the bat, and that is, what are oysters?
All right, oysters. Well, I pass that back to Susana because she's ready to go.
Yeah, so oysters are, so if you're familiar with seafood, some of your shellfish will be things like clams, oysters, or you can have more crustaceans like lobsters and crabs. But oysters, they are shellfish, they are bivalve mollusks, and they are filter feeders. So instead of eating like little animals or big particles, they eat small little filtering things out that are in the water.
I just want us right now.
And I just hear a lot of sound. So shellfish will be, I guess oysters are shellfish, and shellfish are part of the bivalve mollusks, animals that live in the ocean. Oysters specifically are also saltwater animals, freshwater oysters very much. And we have an oyster farm where we grow oysters and just oysters currently. But, yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about yourself? How did you get into oyster farming? Do you love oyster farming? What is Long Island about?
Yeah. So my parents started Will's Hole Oyster Farm in 2002 when I was just about 4 years old. They were working in New York City. They had a software company, and they were retiring kind of from that software company in 2000 when they had my brother and me. And they had this beautiful house here out in Greenport, and they had found out that they actually owned the 5 acres of water bottom right in front of our house. And my dad loves history. He read up into the history of Greenport specifically. And Greenport has a large history of being a whaling community in the 1800s. And in the 1900s, they were the oyster capital of New York. And so they decided that to teach my brother and I kind of how to work, especially outdoors, hands-on, and kind of the concepts of hard work, they decided to start an oyster farm. Originally, it was going to be a much smaller little family fun thing. But over the years, it became a much bigger and, well, it's taken over my parents' whole lives. So I grew up working on my parents' farm on weekends, after vacation, holidays, and everything. And I actually ended up studying biology in college. I graduated a couple years ago, and I actually still work with shellfish. I work at University as their shellfish technician. So 20 years later, I'm still working with oysters. And I really love oyster farming. It's really great to see the environmental benefits. It's great to see people that get to learn things, like these students that are learning about oysters and oyster farming. And it's also great to see the community of oyster farmers that have kind of died out in the last several decades because, right, oyster capital of New York in the early 1900s. But around the end of the 60s into the early 2000s, oyster farming was practically non-existent here on Long Island. There were very, very few farmers. So over the last 20 years, we have actually had a large resurgence of oyster farmers, and that's also been a really great thing to be a part of and to see and to work with.
So we definitely have a question, a great question from our students, and they want to know, how do you start with oysters? Where do they start? We know we find them in the water, but as far as a farm, what is aquaculture, and how do you start to farm oysters?
Yeah, so there's different kind of aquaculture, right? Because aquaculture is unlike agriculture, where you're farming on land. Aquaculture, you're farming in the water. So you can have fish farming with fin fish, like you'll see, salmon and tuna, all those big types of fish. But then you go into shellfish aquaculture, and that's where you'll see things more like clams and mussels and oysters. So with oyster farming, you kind of have two main areas of the farming. You have your grow out, which is kind of what our farm focuses on. And then you have your hatchery and nursery aspect, whereas that is where you're going to be making those little oysters. And as time goes on, in a couple weeks and months, they go from these microscopic, tiny, practically non-existent cells to what we refer to as seed, which are the little teeny tiny baby oysters. And once that seed is big enough, after usually about a couple months, the hatcheries will then send the seed to a lot of farms. Not all farms have hatcheries, so a lot of farmers here, especially on Long Island, if you don't really have too much land to work on, it's really hard to have a hatchery. Also, hatcheries require a lot of specific care and algae farming, because you need to feed those little baby oysters. But once you come to the farm, the oysters are a little bit bigger, and they are able to live in the water, whether in a bay or a pond or something like this. As well as when you get those baby oysters to the farm, oftentimes farmers will put them in an upweller before they put them right onto their farm. And an upweller just kind of mimics what you would see in real life, but not exactly out in that bay and part of the water. So we do have a couple upwellers on our farm, and we can kind of go over here and look at one real quick. It is currently shut down for the season, but upwellers will generally run in the summertime from anywhere April to May into August and September. And upwellers are pretty much a big tank. We have a pump that'll pump the salt water right from the bay, right from the ocean, straight into the tank. Normally, there would be what we refer to as silos inside the tank. And inside the silos pretty much look like if you had a 5-gallon bucket, right, like a big bucket, and you have your hole in the bucket on the top, and then on the bottom of the bucket, you have the plastic bottom. But if you replace that plastic bottom with a mesh screen, kind of like what you might see in your window, very fine mesh screen, you would have water now be able to flow up under that bucket, and then we put a little hole out the side for a spout, and it'll go outside the top of the spout. So it comes up from the bottom of the bucket, out through the side of the bucket, and that bucket would go inside the tank. And what that does is that pushes that water flow through, because the baby oysters, similar to how humans might be babies, we can't feed ourselves, change our diapers, we can't take care of ourselves. We're still a little too young for that. So what we would be the parents, and we will make sure that the oysters have the water moving. That's what feeds them. We will rinse them out really daily to every other day, and that's what we do to clean them. And then we also just make sure that they have enough space so that they can continue to grow and be happy and comfortable. And that's just how we kind of take care of their well-being. And those upwellers will work right that whole summer season, because we want to get that really warm waters where the water will be the warmest, usually around July and August. And that will just produce so much algae in the water so that they have plenty of food to eat so that they can grow as much as they can. So that's why we focus on growing those in the summer.
So
and then
I have a great question from Jody Day, and she wanted to know, Jody wanted to know if oysters can live in freshwater or only salt water. You mentioned salt water from the bay. So is there a difference between freshwater and salt water?
Yes, right. So if you've ever been swimming in the ocean and you might have accidentally gotten a little salt water in your mouth, right? It is very salty, that salinity. And here on the East Coast, we have very, very salty waters. You go a little more towards the west coast, they're a little less salty, but they are still salt water. And then you have your brackish water, which is a kind of a mix between your fresh water, like you would see in like a stream or from like the rivers, and then your salt water that is very much like the ocean. And where those two kind of mix is called your brackish water. And oysters can live in brackish water, but they don't really do well in just fresh water. And this might sound funny, but oysters will actually drown if they are exposed to too much fresh water, because they think that they're in their saltwater environment. So they open up to eat and to feed, but then it is not what they are used to. It's not what they can survive on, and that actually ends up killing them. So oysters do need to be in salt waters, or at least brackish waters, in order to survive.
And we had another great question. What do oysters eat? You've mentioned feed multiple times.
So oysters are what we refer to as filter feeders. So they eat the little tiny algae that is in the water. So when you look in the water and you see the blue and green colors of the ocean, right? That means that there's algae there. And algae are these really tiny, tiny little particles that grow and grow, especially in warm waters, especially with a lot of sunlight, they grow. You're not really going to be able to like pick out algae like you would be able to pick out clumps of seaweed, but clumps of seaweed you can kind of imagine as like really giant algae. So the little tiny microalgae that are in the water, those are what the oyster feeds on. So as it just floats in the water column, the algae is just existing, growing, and living. The oysters open up their little shells. The water passes through them. The oysters eat everything that's in there as much as they want, and the water keeps moving through. And that's why we call them filter feeders, because they're filtering out the algae from the water to consume, and the water that keeps going through is now filtered water.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So as we are transitioning to the bay and take a look at some of where the oysters go next, and we're kind of looking at some equipment. Can you kind of tell us what we're looking at as we're going by?
Yeah. So I just told you about the upwellers and how those will take care of those little baby oysters for the summer season. Well, as you now know, it's September and it is our fall season over here. Thank you. Sorry, one sec. So now as we transition into our fall season, the water temperatures are starting to decrease. The waters are getting a little bit colder. So we're not really getting as much food in that warm water. So it's time to kind of get the oysters ready to hibernate. And in the winter, the oysters will actually hibernate. So in the fall, they're going to feed as much as they can, kind of like how bears hibernate and go to sleep in the winter. Oysters will also kind of go to sleep in the winter, where they're not going to eat a lot. They're not going to really do anything, and they're just going to hold over until the spring. So in our fall seasons, the oyster seed that I told you about, our baby oysters, they go into a lot of finer mesh. And, here are some oysters that my parents probably were sorting a couple weeks ago. There's a couple of them left. But this is what the little babies will look like. They'll be anywhere from 15 to 30 millimeters. So you can say they're more going to be around an inch big by the time that they go into these purses. But these are some seed that were probably in the upweller this recent year. And you can also see that this one is dead because the two shells are open, so the oyster actually died. But this one looks like it is actually still alive because both shells are very firmly connected. So maybe we'll throw that back in the water. But we sort them by size just to help put our biggest oysters together and our smallest oysters together, which will help long term. But they go into a purse. This purse, because it is for the seed, has a lined mesh in the middle, a smaller mesh, and that's just to make sure that if there are any oysters that are a little bit on the smaller side, they're not going to fall through. So they're going to go into here. We close it up. They have these little hooks that they have, and this will go onto a rope. The rope goes horizontally. Then the little hooks hook onto the rope, and it can swing around. And then if they're a little bit bigger, they go into a very similar purse that does not have that mesh inside. And that's just so that the holes are a little bit bigger. So it allows more water to go through, more food potentially, and just more flow for the animals to feed off of. And then when our oysters are nice and big, when they're over a year old, closer to 2 years old, they go into our biggest size purses. And these, as you can see, is an even bigger mesh, but same concept where you put them inside, close the top, and you hang them up on the line. In addition, we have a float on the back. And as we go out onto the dock, you'll kind of see why this float is so helpful. But what it does do is the buoyancy of the float will help the purses rock around in the water, because the oysters are heavy. They have these calcium hard shells, so they become quite dense, kind of. A lot of people kind of call them living rocks, because they kind of look like a rock. They're a little bit heavy, and they are alive. So the oysters will weigh down on this purse, but we have them floating in the water, or floating kind of in the water. But as they move around, if they're too heavy, they won't get a nice, good motion. So this float helps just alleviate some of that weight, so they can have a lot more motion while they're in the water. And as you can see, we have a lot of equipment here that is currently, some of it needs to be cleaned and put away for the winter. Some of it we are going to be continuing to use into the fall and into the winter. But if you would like, we can go towards the dock and see some of how our grow out setup is put up.
So as we're transitioning to the dock, I have a great question. And the question is, how old can oysters get?
That is a great question. So oysters can live easily several years. Oftentimes you don't really get to see oysters that are, 10s, 12 dozens of years old or anything like that, because predators eventually get to them in the wild. And a lot of oysters that you see in restaurants are going to be anywhere from 18 months to about 2.5, 3 years. That's generally when most farmers sell them, because that's when they're at a nice size. Because oysters, when you generally see them in restaurants, are usually a little bit small, round, not too big. But they can definitely get a lot bigger, where they're, as big as your foot, bigger than your foot. Especially when they get older, they do still grow, not as fast as they do when they're young. Like kids, you kind of shoot up when you're young, but then you kind of reach a height when you're an adult where you're not growing too much. Oysters, they can still continue to grow into their adult age, but not quickly. So a lot of the oysters that we have, the oldest that they'll usually get is anywhere to 6 to 7 years old, but you can see them over 10 years old sometimes in the wild if you're lucky enough.
So once we have our seed oysters, we don't keep them in those tanks for the lifespan they have on your farm. So what do you do with those oysters next?
So like I showed you, all that equipment that they're going to go into, that is where they will transition onto the farm. So if you look behind me, you'll see a lot of these wooden structures in the water. And the ones that you see out of the water, those are just supports. But if you look close to the water surface, you'll see more wooden beams across. And how it works is that there's a line from one end all the way across, following kind of like that surface of the water, all the way to the other end over closer to the dock. And there are about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so about 7 lines on each array, as we call them. And there's 2 arrays on this side and 2 arrays on my other side. And each of those arrays does have about 7 lines extending from one side to the other. And if you look right next to me, you can see how those purses hang on the lines. So these are currently empty. They're just kind of air drying until we need to fill them up with oysters next. But we'll fill them with oysters, and then how you see them hanging on a line like this, we'll take a bunch of them out into the water and we'll hang them up on the lines further out into the farm. And that is the primary method that we use to grow. It's called the Kushi method, Kusshi, and it's actually a Japanese growing method. And the gear that we use is an Australian made gear. So we use a Japanese growing method with Australian made gear. And this is not a super popular method because you need to have waters that you can access easily. So we're able to access our waters by walking in with wetsuits or bathing suit in the summer, or just going in with like a little floating dock that we carry around. But most farms that you'll see, they'll be out in deeper waters where they only have access by boat, where they're not close to land, and where it's a lot harder to maintain those oysters. And if you look over by our seawall, you'll actually see a lot of our cages. And this is your cage and bag method. This is what most people will use. And there are these cages that have 3 slots going down and 2 slots across. So there are 6 total slots. And in each slot, it's about a hard metal kind of cage, and there are these plastic mesh bags similar to that mesh I described that could be in the bottom of the upweller sieves. Here we have a much bigger mesh made with a hard plastic, and it's a bag at the bottom where it's closed up. At the top, there's an opening. Similarly, you just pour your oysters inside. You'll close them up with, some people use like a little PVC pipe to clamp it along the top. Others use what we call diaper pins, which look like the diaper pins that used to be used in the 1900s to close up babies' diapers. And what that does, it just closes it up nice and tight. And then you'll put them into the cage nice and flat. Then that cage will go out into the water, and that's where they will grow.
Is there a chance that we can see some of your live oysters?
Let's see what we can find.
Uh,
So because a lot of them are in the water right now, it might be a little hard. There are some that my parents actually are going to put back in the water in about an hour or so we can see what it looks like nice and full.
so,
We
and
can
I
also
have,
kind of see what it looks like in the water.
I do have a
Yes.
question from Trevor, and he from Schleck's class, and they would want to know how old is your oldest oyster? Just an estimate. What are the ages of your oysters before you harvest them?
So our minimum age that we harvest them at is 18 months, so a year and a half. Our oysters we tend to keep just a little bit longer. So most of our oysters that we're harvesting are going to be 2 years old, 2 to 3 years old. Our oldest oysters are generally what we like to call or refer to as our jumbos, because they are, our 5-6-year-old oysters. And we do sell them sometimes, just because we don't really have that many of them. So we kind of sell them at holidays, various points where there's not too many because we just don't have the quantity. But probably our oldest would be anywhere from 6 to 8 years old. And they either die over time. Predators get to them. They just die as animals do, or we sell them. So we don't have too many that are older than that. But here are what some of the purses look like when they're all filled up. So here we actually have probably 3-year-old oysters. So remember the oysters I showed you in my hand that were as smaller than my finger? These are as big as my palm. And these are oysters that you will be harvesting and you will be selling. So this is actually what we call our doubles. And that's because generally when you see oysters in like a restaurant, in a farming setting, there are just one oyster, not connected to any others. And that's actually not how you'll find them in the wild. Generally, they will be in clumps of 2 or more attached to rocks, pilings, some other substrate. And sometimes when you're farming them, you'll get oysters that are clumped together. So we refer to these as our doubles, even if they have like 3 or 4 on them. And how that works is that in the hatcheries where I told you about where they spawn them, they'll usually also put what we refer to as culch, which is usually ground up shell and sand. We put that into the water where that external fertilization is happening. And as those little baby larvae are being fertilized and growing and eating and everything, they have 3 weeks where they will swim around and they will attach to something. So in the wild, they attach to other oysters, docks, pilings, rocks, and each other, of course. But when a farming setting, you don't really want to see a pile of oysters in a clump on your plate. So that's why the hatchery makes them all single oysters. But of course, because they are microscopic at that age, you can't count on every single oyster only connecting to a piece of sand and not to another oyster. So sometimes we end up with what we call our doubles. And these are great for if you want to make like a soup. You can shuck them, throw them in a soup because you're not having to worry about presentation. Also, we don't really sell these very much because people don't want the doubles. So my parents often eat these.
So as your oysters mature and they're ready to sell, where do y'all sell your oysters?
So since we're located on Long Island, probably 99% of our oysters go into Manhattan and into New York City. Generally, in some of the spring through fall months, we'll sell to some of the local restaurants around here. But most of the time, it's into New York City. My parents will do a trip into Manhattan once a week where they harvest during the days that they're not in the city. And then delivery day comes, they take all the oysters that they've harvested, they'll put them into our little delivery van, ice them down nice and cold, and they drive into the city and disperse them to all the different restaurants. Most of our clients in New York City are restaurants. They're not really kind of wholesalers like fish markets or anything like that. We do have a couple that are like the lobster place in New York City is like a fish market type of thing where you can go in and buy the oysters as a person. You don't have to get them cooked or prepared in any way, right? Kind of like a grocery store. But most of the time, it is going to be restaurants. And what we have here are some of the oysters that, even though they are the right age to be sold, right? They are at least 18 months, 2 years or whatever. They're not the right size to be sold. And generally, you want them to be about 3 inches or bigger. That's what most people prefer. Some of these are really small or they'll be really skinny. If you want a nice, tasty oyster, you often want one that's going to have a good substance in the middle. So you want to have a nice deep cup, which means you'll probably have like a fat oyster. But as you can see, this one's pretty flat. So we'll give it a couple more months, perhaps the winter, to grow. Some of these are also doubles. Some of them have a little bit of a cup, but then if you look on the backside, they're still pretty small. So these we call our go-backs, and as you can see, there's a couple more. They're a little bit on the small side, a little bit on the skinny side, so they're not ready to go off into a restaurant. So they'll come back and they'll stay on the farm. They go back into their little purses, ready to grow. And this afternoon, my parents, during low tide, which is in about 2 or 3 hours, they'll jump in the water. And my dad puts on his wetsuit, jumps in the water. My mom will throw off the cages, the purses off into the water, and my dad will walk around and put them all in. But if you just take a peek right over the railing, you'll see what they look like on the lines. So I told you about the lines that extend from one side to the other and how the purses float on them. So they are attached at 2 points to a line where they just clip on and you can unclip them pretty easily. And then, as you can see on some of them, they do have their floats, and that does help them to be a little more buoyant and to move around with the waves. And the reason that we grow them like this is because we want them to move around like that. That rocking motion helps with the shaping of the oyster, because naturally our oysters kind of tend to grow long. A lot of people prefer them to be a little bit shorter and rounder, but with a nice deep cup. So by tossing them, you're kind of tumbling them, and almost like you would a fingernail, you're kind of filing it a little bit short. So by filing it, you're maintaining that length, and you're kind of forcing that growth to go downwards and hoping that you get a nice rounder cup. And that's what a lot of the restaurants like. Also, because they are at the top of the water column now, they're going to be in the warmer waters, right? If you've ever gone swimming and you're at the shoreline where it's a lot, maybe a couple inches or a foot deep, it's usually going to be a bit warmer. But if you go out into the waters where it's 6-7 feet deep and even deeper, it's going to get a lot cooler as you get deeper and deeper. So in that cage method, the oysters are at the bottom of that water column where you're not getting as much sunlight, you're not getting as much warmth, and algae, of course, because algae wants to grow in the warm waters and that sunlight. But when you're deep down, there's not going to be as much, though it will still be there. So with this method, while we're at the top of the water column, there's a lot more sunlight, a lot more warm water, and of course, more algae production, therefore more food for the animals to eat. And then last of all, it also just helps maintain a lot of growth. So if you look at this purse, on the bottom, this is what we call fouling or biofouling. We have tufts of like seaweeds, tunicates. These we call lady slippers or slipper shells. You'll often see them at the beach. They're similar to like a snail or an abalone, if you're familiar with those at all. But then of course you have all this dried up stuff. And that's why these are actually hanging up out here, because they are what we call, where they're air drying. And we're waiting for all this stuff to die and fall off so that it can clean this up and be not as fouled up. So with this method, at high tide, like it is kind of right now, they're covered with the water or mostly covered with the water. As the tide goes down, though, they'll actually be exposed to the air and they will not be in the water. And that kind of gives you smaller amounts of time where they air dry. So that helps with a lot of that fouling growth. While the oysters can survive, they'll clamp up nice and tight. They're very hardy little animals, and they'll be perfectly fine for about 3 or 4 hours in the air. Some of that fouling, like seaweeds especially, will dry up in the sunlight, especially on a summer's day where it's going to be hot air temperature, that sunlight, that'll dry up some of that fouling and it'll die. And so then when they're covered by water again, there's not as much fouling there. If you're working with that cage and bag method, that fouling accumulates and accumulates in the bottom of the water column. And when you pull it up to go through them, it's not only really dense with all that fouling, it's a lot heavier, of course, because a lot of those things are filled with water, right? Seaweeds, they're very watery. A lot of the other things like tunicates and flipper shells are also heavy. And then also because, as you saw how thick it is, it's blocking up those holes, right? Because those holes we wanted for the flow of the water to go through to provide food for the animals. But when all this fouling condenses up on it, you're now limiting that amount of water that can move through, and you're limiting the amount of food. And if you're limited so much food, you start to starve, and that's very unhealthy for them. Similar to how we need a constant food of every day, they also need food every single day. And if they don't have that food, they're not going to keep growing. They're not going to do well. They're going to start getting stressed out. They're not going to have what they need to be a happy and healthy animal. So we want to maintain them without having to bring them up every couple of months being covered in this stuff. So when they're allowed to come out of the air for a couple hours at a time, it helps reduce that amount of work, not only for us, but also just ease of access and comfort.
So we only have a few minutes left, but I want to just do a quick question and throw out a bunch of questions because I have a lot of great questions in the Q&A. So if you just give us some quick answers, and we're gonna try to get as many questions in as possible. Miss Day's class wants to know: do you ever lose cages in bad weather?
Yes, we do. Oh, that is terrible when that happens. So especially in big storms and hurricanes, a lot of the purses, because I did tell you how they have only the two clasps. The clasps can sometimes break at the base and then they fall off, and we don't always find them because then they'll float around. And sometimes with these cages is that in the summer when there's a lot of boaters, some of them don't notice the buoys and they'll get caught up in a buoy and they'll just cut off the line instead of unraveling it. And then that cage is now lost because normally the buoy marks where it is so we can see it from the top of the water. But when they cut off that line, the cage no longer has that buoy. And since that cage sits in the bottom of the water column, if that's, 10 feet deep, you can't see that. So we have lost many a cage during storms and boating seasons and stuff like that. And it is not fun because sometimes you'll find it, months or years later and you're like, oh, wow, everything died. Or, it'll be very sad.
I have another great question, and this has been asked multiple times. What are the predators other than humans? What are oysters' predators?
So their natural predators are going to be some things like green crabs or blue crabs, crabs that have those big pinching claws that can pry open the shells. Starfish, sea stars are another big predator, as well as you'll see smaller things like oyster drills, which look very kind of similar to whelks or conchs, but very teeny tiny. And then what else? Whelks and conchs as well are also predators to oysters.
Oh.
And yeah,
Mason
that's probably the big ones.
Mason wants to know, can oysters move underneath the water if they're not in a cage?
So unlike scallops, where they swim around and clams dig down into the sediment, those 3 weeks I told you about where they swim to attach to something, that is the only time in their life where they will move. Once they attach to something, they will sit there for the rest of their lives and they do not move. So they are pretty much like rocks. They don't move, they don't swim. The only thing they do is open up to feed and close down. They don't have the ability to crawl or swim or float around anywhere.
Another great question is, do you deal with algae blooms like we see in the rest of New York? Do those affect your oyster, or does it affect your oyster farm?
So luckily for us, we do not get too many harmful algal blooms or just algal blooms that do take a toll on our farm. So we have a few reasons as to why we're lucky enough. So the area that we're in has a very fast flow. So algae blooms, right, they bloom in an area, but if there's nothing moving it around, then they'll kind of sit there, and that can start taking effect on the environment where it might kill fish. It takes away the oxygen, stuff like that. But because our flow moves so much, that if there is somewhat of an algal bloom, of whether it's a harmful one or not, they tend to keep moving. And that kind of, if it is harmful, it'll kind of stay for a little bit but move forward. But we also don't really have harmful algal blooms in our area. There are areas, though, still on Long Island, like 50 miles away, that do suffer from harmful algal blooms that will close down their farm for several weeks to several months, depending on the severity of it. And that does take a toll on a lot of the farmers because that is their livelihood. So when they're closed down from the harmful algal blooms, a lot of them have second jobs that they have to resort to and stuff like that. But luckily for us, we do not suffer from a lot of those harmful algal blooms. The only times where we might really see closures are during storms, because here on Long Island, we are an island that's very kind of low. We don't have right hills and stuff like that. So when we get a lot of rain, especially from big storms, that runoff can tend to run into our Peconic estuary, into the Long Island Sound, and that can pollute the waters because that runoff, right, is touching everything on the ground. It's touching fertilizers in people's grasses. It's touching dog poop on the side of the road. It's touching trash and stuff that's around. So it kind of touches all that, and it pulls some of that with it into the water bodies, and that can have a really negative aspect. And especially here in our Peconic estuary, we do have a lot of problems with water quality that we try to work on to help alleviate some of that runoff pollution and to try to have cleaner waters for aquaculture, boaters, fishers, and just your regular person that wants to go swimming.
So our final question, what do oysters taste like, and do you like to eat oysters?
So oysters taste like, for us here on the East Coast, they're going to be a lot salty. They're going to be really salty because I told you about how they filter feed. That's also how they get a lot of their flavor. So if they're being grown in really salty waters, they're going to taste pretty salty. On the West Coast, the salinity levels are a little bit lower, so they're going to have a little bit of a sweeter taste to them. There are also different species of oysters that you can eat. So there's like the Japanese oysters called Kumamoto oysters. Here on the East Coast, we all commercial farmers, we grow the Chrysostrea virginica, or our East Coast oyster. Those are the ones that you've seen in all these little things here. But the West Coast, they have a Pacific oyster, the Gigas. Europe has their own oyster as well. So each of the species itself will be a little bit different, but for the most part, they're going to have like a briny taste. They're going to have a salty taste. They're going to, sometimes they have a little bit like a sweetness, or like some people describe it as like a butteriness, like it's a very smooth flavor. Personally, growing up, I actually was not a big fan of oysters, and my mom always told me to stop telling people that, because she's like, how can you run an oyster farm if you don't like oysters? But I'm very sensitive to food textures, so that's why I really didn't like them. But I loved eating them cooked, and to this day, I still love eating them cooked. My favorite way, my mom makes a great oysters Rockefeller, which has like breadcrumbs and cheese and spinach on them, very tasty in the oven. And then also, I love having them on the grill, which is a great way for people that don't know how to shuck or are not confident in their shucking abilities. You don't have to shuck the oyster, you just put it on a grill. And then when you see the water kind of bubbling, or if you see the shell crack open, you can take it off, open it up. You don't have to worry about hurting yourself. You just pry the shell open, and then you can put whatever you want on it. Lemon juice, cocktail sauce. Personally, I think a little bit of butter is the best way to have it. But I do love eating oysters cooked now, and we're still working on it. I do eat them, just not super often.
Well, thank you so much for your time. It was an awesome tour. We really appreciate it. You were a great host, and many of our students are going off to lunch, so I think you left them hungry. So we really appreciate it. And for any people who take a trip down to Long Island, they're more than welcome to visit you at Widow's Hole. I know you offer tours. So have a
Yes.
great rest of your season, and to all of our classes out there, have a great rest of your school day.
Yeah.
Bye,
Thank you,
everybody.
everyone. Bye.